KWANZAA is a Pan-African and African-American holiday that is a celebration of family, community, and culture. It is organized around 7 fundamental principles, and it's a 7-day holiday that begins from December the 26th and goes to January 1st. And it's 7 days to, in fact, teach the 7 principles, okay, which are in Swahili and then in English: Umoja, unity; Kujichagulia, self-determination; UJAMAA, collective work and responsibility; UJAMAA, cooperative economics; NIA, purpose; Kumba, creativity; and Imani, faith.
So when I say Baragani, you say UJAMAA, UJAMAA. Let's get some love in there. Baragani. UJAMAA. Oh, I feel like I've been greeted now. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. I am Yolanda Jack, the manager of community engagement here. KWANZAA got started celebrated way back in 1966. Was the first celebration being formed by Dr. Malanga Karanga and the US organization in 1965 in Los Angeles, California. The first celebration happened after the Watts Rebellion, or riots happened. And it was a beautiful way to remember the best of us. And so it's because of the resilience, because of these aspects of the Nguvu Saba that we are here today. So I'm happy to celebrate and to share this celebration with you all today. And with these amazing brothers who are going to be playing some amazing music for you all this afternoon. So you all are in a good spot. The tradition in many African activities, ceremonies, celebrations, etc., is that when we begin, before we begin, we ask and make sure that it's good with the elders in the space. Is there anything that we need to discuss or figure out before we get started? So, accordingly, may we begin?
Yes.
Thank you so very much. Baba Kafense, will you please pour the libation?
Yeah, Habaragani. KWANZAA is a celebration of African and African American culture. And it has grown from being celebrated in small family settings and gatherings to being celebrated all over the world. And even though it's based on principles that come from African culture, it started here, and unlike the people that were taken out of Africa and dispersed around the world, it started here and has been dispersed throughout the African diaspora and wherever African people are. Conscious black people in this country around the time KWANZAA was founded adopted Kiswahili as the language of the Black Power movement and our liberation struggle here because of its tie to the freedom movements in Africa. So that's why we use Kiswahili. KWANZAA celebrated for 7 days. Everybody knew that, right? Everybody knows the 7 principles?
Nguvu Saba, Umoja, unity; Kujichagulia, self-determination; UJAMAA, collective work and responsibility; UJAMAA, cooperative economics; NIA, purpose; Kumba, creativity; and Imani, faith.
7 principles, but these 7 principles represent a value system. And the purpose of the value system is to give us a value system to replace the value system that was imposed on us during slavery.
There are 7 essential symbols.
What's essential for the KWANZAA celebration, as you see here, is a KWANZAA table. We pour libations, and what we do is invite our ancestors to come be a part of our celebration today. And we're celebrating UJAMAA. So I'll say the name of an ancestor. The collective response will be Nsa. Can you say Nsa? Nsa. And Nsa means to drink. So if I say Charles H. Wright, you'll say Nsa. And I'll pour some water into the plant here. We're literally inviting their energy to come into our midst and sanction what we're doing. And from this, after we pour the libation, we're going to begin the concert with a musical libation, which is a prelude to our first composition called For Nkrumah, or the African Fight Song. Are you ready for that?
Yes.
So we always acknowledge Almighty God first. We don't ask God to drink, so we don't say Nsa. We simply say Yo to affirm the vastness of Almighty God, who there's only one, the source of everything, who's known to all,
Who was revealed to all and known by many names. To Almighty God we say, Yo.
Yo.
The Akan people believe that Nana Asasi Yah, Mother Earth, is the symbolic spouse of Almighty God, because as God provides all of our needs, specifically our spiritual needs, Nana Asasi Yah, Mother Earth, provides all of our physical needs: medicine, food, clothing, and shelter. To Nana Asasi Yah, we say inside.
Inside.
To one of the oldest human ancestors of all people, not just black people, who is an African woman, and let me just split that up, who is African and a woman, who we call Mother Dinkness, the mitochondria mother of all human beings, we say inside.
Inside.
The founders and sustainers of the classical East African civilizations which emerged in the Nile Valley, we say inside. To the founders and sustainers of the classical West African civilizations which span from 300 AD to 1600 AD and conclude Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, we say inside. The decline of African culture and the rise of European culture was facilitated by the transatlantic slave trade and the Columbus voyages. Those were two of the major events. The transatlantic slave trade begins in 1500, and this led to the dispossession of African people throughout what we now call the African diaspora. The Middle Passage was a part of the journey from when our ancestors were put on ships until they disembarked or unboarded the ships wherever they landed in various places like Cuba, Haiti, Suriname, Belize, the United States. The African people, the people that look like you and I, that we see in these various places, are the survivors of those, are the descendants of those that survived the Middle Passage, as are we. However, there were literally hundreds, millions that died during the Middle Passage, whose names we will never know. But we always acknowledge them in the sacrifice of their lives as part of our re-Africanization process. For the Africans lost during the Middle Passage, we say inside. Contrary to popular belief, we fought every step of the way to the Great Bookman, we say inside. Sojourner Truth, we say inside. Harriet Tubman, we say inside. Charles H. Wright, we say inside. Coleman Alexander Young, we say inside. Reverend Albert B. Clegg, we say inside. Dr. Martin Luther King, we say inside. Coretta Scott King, we say inside. Elijah Muhammad, we say inside. Malcolm X, we say inside. Betty Shabazz, we say inside. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, we say inside. Amy Jake Garvey, we say inside. Amy Ashwood Garvey, we say inside. We pour a libation for all of our collective family ancestors. Each and every one of us here literally carries the genes, the DNA, from our maternal, our mother's side, and paternal, our father's side, which can be traced all the way back to Mother Dinkness. All of us have a big mama, an Auntie Bill, or Papa Jim that maybe tapped their bottom when it needed to be done. Of course, nobody here needed that, right? Or gave you that number, told you to play 268 straight and in the box. Oh, this is not Black Detroit. So we want you to say out the names of your personal family ancestors. Just say their name. At this time, we pour libations for our collective family ancestors, both our mother and father lineage, tracing us all the way back to the oldest human being. For our collective family ancestors, we say inside. And we pour a libation for those new spirits coming forth from the Creator. They all come here, as does everything in creation, with a divine purpose. So we welcome those spirits coming forth, and we're charged with the responsibility to ensure that they learn their purpose, or that they know it, and that we are responsible for helping them to fulfill it as well. We put a qualifier though. We pour a libation for those spirits coming forth that,
Repeat after me, will bring about positive change. Okay, I hope I didn't say it like that. Will bring about positive change, cultural restoration, re-Africanization, and the building of nationhood and sovereignty for African people everywhere, forever.
We say Ensemble, Ensemble, Ensemble. Now there's a lot of different ways to pour libations and or to perform libations. We now present to you libations, which will segue into 4 Nkrumah. Asante Sana, thank you very much. opened it with libations, and I surprised the band. You weren't expecting the segment of the song I did at the end was a libation song from the Akan people of Ghana, West Africa. So I thought we would cap the song off with libations as well. So that's for Nkrumah. Nkrumah is very important. It's also known as the African fight song. Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana, which was the first country to gain its independence in 1957. Strongly influenced. He came to the United States and went to Lincoln University. He was strongly influenced by Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and it has a lot to do with why you see the black star on the Ghanaian flag. So, what's the first principle of KWANZAA? Umoja, which is unity. We must work together, live together, produce together, and bring ourselves together. And we know that if we could be united, or if we were united, there's so much we could accomplish. So everybody say Umoja. Umoja. Unity. Unity. The next song is Soft Blue. Could you just give us a little background on the Soft Blue? This is Kareem Gideon, one of the arrangers and composers of In the Tradition.
Soft Blue was composed by the great Lee Morgan. Recorded on an album that was Jackie McLean's album. Jackknife? Yeah. Jackknife. Lee Morgan is an interesting cat because, like all of us, we have problems, but he had consciousness, he was aware. In his collective book, he had tunes like Search for the New Land, Mr. Kenyatta. You know, his brother was deep. He was a longtime member of the Jazz Messengers, which is Art Blakey or Ualadina, who spent some time in West Africa learning African rhythms and brought that back home to the States and spearheaded the post-bop movement known as hard bop, him along with Horace Silver. They formed the Jazz Messengers. Their purpose was to spread the message of the music and unify the culture, because at that time, you know, bebop changed everything, where the Black American music went from a dance music, where we used to go to the dance halls and we would hear Ellington and Count Basie play, and then bebop came. It became a concert music. So hard bop was a way for us to get back to that, where they focused more also on the blues and gospel and R&B. So soft blue is symbiotic of bringing that groove back into the collective consciousness of the people. So this is Lee Morgan's soft blue.
And what I neglected to say, a couple of things. Jazz, and remember the first principle is what again? Umoja. Jazz in many ways was a collective response of black people responding to the oppression and to some degree the indoctrination of European culture, because what we did in creating blues and then jazz was take European instruments and in some cases modalities and apply an African sensibility to those instruments and art forms. And Lee Morgan was a major contributor to the jazz tradition. And jazz, in many ways, was also an expression of Kuji Chagalia. Can you say Kuji Chagalia? Kuji Chagalia means self-determination. And what a major oversight, and I want to apologize for this, the first compositions we did were by our band leader, composer, and arranger, Olajimi Tafatano. So let's give him a round of applause. Much of the music, most of our music, and we have a songbook that is over 100 compositions. Many of them, or most of them, are original compositions. So this is one that we're borrowing, Soft Blue, from a jazz great, but of course it's arranged and produced by our in-house people. We now present to you Soft Blue. Obaragani. Are you sure? Okay, that's the second principle on Kwanzaa. What was the name of the tune we just did? Soft Blue, and who's the composer? Lee Morgan, who's now an ancestor who unfortunately met with a tragic death, but he left a rich legacy of music. One of his favorite songs that I can think of is Ciora. It's a very beautiful song. The next composition is African Beauty. Is that correct? Do I need to explain? This is an original composition for my own Baba Olugini. What was the inspiration? I know I don't have to ask, but I want you to tell.
My mother and all of you African queens out there.
Let's try it again. African Beauty. And the third principle is UJAMAA. African Beauty. Bargani. Okay, we're doing good. And thanks for helping to get me refocused. We have another original composition, and the fourth principle of Kwanzaa is what again? We just did UJAMAA, which is collective work and responsibility. We now are going to UJAMAA, which is cooperative economics. We now present to you another original composition called Mushaka. Can you say Mushaka? And Mushaka, it means trouble, yes? Yes. So lend us your spirit and your energy as we present to you Mushaka.
Baragani. What was the name of the last composition? Ushaka, and what does it mean? Trouble. Say that again. It says we need a rest. I said, oh. I love this story. Let me introduce you to the band. We'll start with our keyboardist.
Hi everyone, my name is Kayvon Williams.
And Alexander Webb play the bass.
Hi everyone, I'm Christopher White. I play drums.
Calvin Taylor, baritone saxophone.
Oh, Jimmy, tough and on the saxophones and food.
The Razor, leader of the band, leader of the TheTradition Jazz Ensemble, was still Jimmy Toffentone. Make sure you get your flowers on that. And there's me. There's a good old me, Mr. Kareem Gideon.
Co-producer, co-arranger.
Just someone who plays the 16th century archaic torture device known as a trumpet.
Next principle is Nia, which means what? Purpose. And we all come here, I said that when we did the libations, with a divine purpose. And KWANZAA, through the volume system and the practice of those principles, can help lead us to our purpose.
We now present to you Ebonist. Can you say that? Ebonist.
Ebonist.
Bargani. Bargani. As we say the principle, what does it mean again? Cooperative economics. What was the name of the last tune? Evidence. And I mentioned Roy Brooks, who also known as Njumbe, but I didn't say much about him. He was a master percussionist. He left a rich legacy of music. He actually has a complete suite of songs that are dedicated to each principle of the Nguzo Saba. So the next principle is Kuumba. Can you say Kuumba? Which means creativity. And we all come here with creativity. It's a part of who we are. It's given to us by our Creator. So we are in essence co-creators. But along with coming here with the responsibility to create and manifest that spirit of the Creator, we also have the challenge and the responsibility to leave this place, the earth, much more beautiful than it was when we inherited it. So remember that as Kuumba, that's the sixth principle. We now present to you Freddie Hubbard's Our rendition arranged by creative arrangers and composers. We now present to you Crisis. Habaragani. Habaragani.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the program. So let's give another round of applause for TheTradition. I now will begrudgingly and reluctantly return the microphone to my dear sister, Mama Yo.
So we get ready to get started. We're going to light the first candle. It is, shout it out for me. Unity. Our second principle is
self-determination.
Our third principle,
Collective work.
collective work and responsibility. And the last principle that we will light together today, UJAMAA, cooperative economics. And before we leave, there's one last thing. At the end, before we moved away from each other, before we departed to go back to our separate homes, etc., they did what's called pulling harambes. Harambe, Kiswahili is the word of KWANZAA. Harambe means to pull together. And so that really is an opportunity for us to think about some of the aspects of the principles. Unity, self-determination, collective work responsibility. When you pull together, all three of those things are involved, yeah? Yes. So, please, if you are able to, stand on up. And we're going to pull these harambes. It is a physical gesture and a word at the same time. And we'll say the word 7 times. On the 7th time, we will say it as long and as strong as we can, because that's how much we want to pull together. Moja mbili tatu, begin. Harambe, 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 harambe. Harambe! 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 Thank you so much for coming into the Charles H. Wright Museum.